the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we present excerpts from the Dermis Probe by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Ansari's Answer. When Behuddin Naqshband was sitting in his reception hall one day, an insolent aristocrat, travelling in the service of a certain sultan, demanded entry. "Let him in," said Behuddin. The envoy, after exchanging general salutations with the Maulana, said, "One reason why I have made a detour to see you is to ask a very direct question. It is this: what exactly is your situation and status in life? I, for instance, can describe myself as an emir, and I travel in the service of an emperor. Other people are great lords, merchants, scholars, and so on. Everyone has a designation in any civilized country. What are your pretensions, and what are we to call you? People call you a king, shah, and a lord, and also a teacher. But the smallest literate with 3 boys in front of him is a teacher, and there are kings with no power at all beyond their name." Mirza Ansari said, "Maulana, may I be permitted to answer this question?" The Maulana said, "If the prince will accept your answer as sufficiently authoritative." The prince said, "Yes, for one does not usually ask anyone anything directly if one can get information on the matter from an informed subordinate." Mirza Ansari said, "Our lord, Maulana, is a man who is visited by kings. Princes ask his advice. Aristocrats and scholars seek what he has to tell and show them. Merchants and nobles, commanders and even sultans sign themselves to him, your servant. So he has no rank which is below that of such people. He cannot be less than a sultan, whether he has the possession of land or not. He is not described as higher, because there is nobody higher to accord him this rank. My impression is that by visiting him, you have not demeaned yourself. But you will have to ask someone greater than an emperor as to what his rank is, if we are to interpret even in terms of this world." Maulana Behuddin said, "Would it not, therefore, be better to withdraw the question, since it seems to defy an answer?" Two pieces of advice. There was once a king who had been trying to treat his subjects with enlightened kindness and the minimum of control. The people showed signs of disaffection, and instead of showing cooperation and respect for the administration, became complaining and turbulent. The king was standing on the ramparts of one of his castles one day in the midst of these preoccupations, when he saw a free dervish in a patched robe sitting on the ground below him. The king thought, "These dervishes are reputed to know all secrets. There will be no harm in seeking his counsel." He outlined his problem to the dervish and said, "I want a piece of advice in this matter." The dervish said, "I shall give you not 1 piece, but 2 pieces of advice." "Oh, thank you," said the king, "but all I need is 1 bit of advice." "In that case," said the dervish, "I would say to you, if you must rule, then rule." So the king increased the power of his control over the people, and treated them with such severity that they revolted. Before very long he was forced to flee, and barely escaped with his life, disguised in a dervish robe. He found himself in a forest, where, stopping to wash his face in a stream, he saw the dervish who had advised him, sitting in contemplation. The king said, "This is where your advice has brought me." "Would you like to hear the second piece of advice?" asked the dervish. "I can lose nothing more, so I had better hear it," said the king. "The second piece of advice," said the dervish, "is, never ask for advice, nor act upon it, without satisfying yourself that the giver of the advice is a qualified person." The gifts. 3 pilgrims brought offerings to a Sufi teacher. The first presented a flask of valuable perfume, the second a handkerchief in which were tied a number of gold coins, the third some rare spices, worth their weight in silver. The Sufi put some of the perfume on the palms of his hands. He gave away the money to a passer-by, and he handed back the spices to the man who had brought them. Some of the people who regularly went to observe the doings of the sheikh discussed among themselves the meaning of these actions. They decided that the gift of the perfume was accepted, and that this indicated favor for the giver, an acknowledgement of his spiritual attainments, real or to come. That the giving away of the gold meant that the sage was showing his indifference to material things, that the returning of the spices indicated a rebuff for the man who had offered them. It was many years before the audience learnt, since they were not initiated Sufis, of the real message behind the actions of the Sufi. The explanation, given by a teaching master, was this. The sheikh had used the perfume to please the giver, since this man was still at the stage where he needed the support of worldly reward. He had given away the gold in order to teach the giver something which he lacked, which was real generosity. He had returned the spices to make the donor understand that possession of costly spices was nothing. It was the effort which had gone into their acquiring which mattered. And this effort it was which had already transformed that pilgrim and made him worthy to use the spices in still another way. How far is man in general from being able to interpret the meaning of events? It is only in the circle of the elect that these things are understood. If you are too superior a man to use a piece of string, do not be surprised if a rope is too large for the job. Proverb. The fox who was made a Sufi. A fox was raiding all the farms of a certain country and carrying off chickens. The villagers called in a Sufi of great repute and asked him to help them by catching it. He took out a charm and laid it in a certain place, and in quite a short time the fox was found helplessly rooted to the spot. When the villagers saw this, they were delighted. But as they gathered around, the Sufi took away the power of the charm and tied something on a collar around the fox's neck. Then, instead of handing it over to the people to be killed, he set it loose. The villagers were in an uproar and said, "Whatever are you doing? Now the fox will start thieving all over again." "No," said the Sufi. "I have put the symbol of the way around his neck, and Sufis are not thieves, so he will not steal again, but confine his attentions to wild creatures." "But you could have killed him just as easily," said the people. "Ah," said the Sufi, "I needed him to have a little punishment, so that he might reform in thought as well as action." "But how can it be punishment to give him the mark of the Sufi?" "Don't you know? Well now, whenever anyone sees him, they will drive him away from the haunts of men, saying, 'You are irrational, an enemy of scholars,' and scholars are, of course, the most wise of mankind." When a man comes to see you. Bahuddin Naqshband said, "When a man comes to see you, remember that his behavior and his speech are a compound. He has not come to buy, to sell, to convince you, to give or to gain comfort, to understand or make you understand. he has almost invariably come to do or try to do all of these things, and many more. Like the skins of an onion, he will peel off one depth after another. Finally, you will find by what he says, what he is inwardly perceiving of you. When this time arrives, you will completely ignore the apparent substance and significance of his speech or actions, because you will be perceiving the reality beyond. Note well that the other individual, while he does this, is almost always totally unaware that he is talking the language of the heart, direct communication. He may imagine that there is a scholarly, cultural, or other reason for his behavior. This is the way in which the Sufi reads minds which cannot read themselves. In addition, the Sufi knows how competent at real understanding the other person is, how much he really knows, ignoring what he thinks he knows, and how much he really can progress. This is a major purpose of Sohbat, human companionship. This podcast is copyright 2016, the Idries Shah Foundation.